All right, let's jump right into this. For this explainer, I want you to imagine for a moment that you're stepping right into my shoes, the dusty, ink-stained shoes of an Ottoman court historian in the late 15th century. It's my literal life's work to record the true, incredibly complex life of my master, Sultan Mehmed II. Now, you probably know him simply as Mehmed the Conqueror, but as a chronicler living inside his vibrant and, yeah, sometimes totally ruthless court, I can tell you firsthand that the man who built this empire was way more fascinating than the myths. Today, we're going to dig into the actual records, the decrees, and the sheer force of will that transformed a young, struggling prince into a world-shaping monarch. He famously and very boldly proclaimed himself the Sultan of two lands and the Khan of two seas. I mean, the sheer scale of his ambition was just staggering. This wasn't just some fancy title. It was a grand geopolitical vision. Mehmed wasn't content with just running a regional kingdom. He envisioned this massive, sweeping empire bridging Europe and Asia, linking the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. But to really understand how he earned a title like that, we have to look back at exactly where he started. Section 1. The Young Sultan's Rise. Let's look at the highly tumultuous and precarious early life of the young prince before he became a legend. So, his rise to power, it was anything but smooth. Back in 1444, at just 12 years old, 12, his father, Mehmed II, actually abdicated, leaving this young boy sitting on the throne. And it was pure chaos. Rivals and European crusaders immediately tested him, sensing weakness. By 1446, the crisis got so severe that his father literally had to step back into power, sending young Mehmed away to govern a province and do a bit of growing up. But when Murad died in 1451, Mehmed returned for his second reign. He was 19 now, and let me tell you, he had learned his lesson. He came back with a singular, absolutely unyielding focus to take the ultimate prize, the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. And that brings us right to 1453. Section 2. Fall of the Roman capital. This was absolutely the epic defining climax of his early reign. 57 days. That is exactly how long the grueling, bloody siege of Constantinople lasted in the spring of 1453. As a chronicler, the numbers we recorded were just mind-boggling. Mehmed brought in an army of up to 200,000 troops and these massive new bombards, literally giant cannons that battered away at the ancient walls. But the Byzantines were smart. They had a massive iron chain blocking their harbor, the Golden Horn. So what does this 21-year-old sultan do? He orders 80 galleys to be rolled entirely overland on greased wooden planks, completely bypassing the chain. It was a brilliant, wild tactical feat. And on May 29th, the ancient city finally fell. But the aftermath wasn't just about chest-pumping triumph. It was actually profoundly reflective. When the young sultan finally stepped into the ruined Bukaleon, the ancient palace of the Caesars, he didn't boast. Instead, as our court records show, he quietly recited these very poignant lines from the Persian poet Saadi. The spider is curtain-bearer in the palace of Chosroes. The owl sounds the relief in the castle of Afrasiab. It's this incredibly beautiful, melancholic acknowledgement of the fleeting nature of power and empires. Section 3. Ghazi and Caesar of Rome. Here, we're going to explore the fascinating juxtaposition of his dual identities. You see, Mehmed was constantly balancing two seemingly opposing worlds. On one hand, he was the Islamic Ghazi, the holy warrior. His mentor had deeply instilled in him the Islamic duty to overthrow the Byzantine Empire, and he fiercely continued to expand into the Balkans with the sword of Islam. But right upon taking the city, Mehmed officially claimed a completely shocking new title, Kaiser-i-Rum, literally Caesar of Rome. Because Constantinople had been the seat of the Roman Empire since 330 AD, he genuinely believed whoever held the city was the rightful ruler of the Roman Empire. He wasn't just destroying the old world, he was claiming its entire legacy for himself. So let's look at how he actually put this Roman authority into practice, step by step. First, he installed Gennadius Scalarius as the Orthodox Patriarch, making him a highly powerful leader within the new Ottoman state. Second, he purposefully granted religious and property autonomy to the Christians living in the city. And third, and this is probably the most surprising, he didn't just execute all the surviving Byzantine royalty, he actually absorbed them. The nephews of the last Byzantine emperor were taken right into his palace service. One of them even became a grand vizier later on. Mehmed was actively building a hybrid, highly pragmatic empire. Section 4. Centralizing the Ottoman state. Let's shift our focus from his outward conquests to his radical transformation of the empire's internal governance. Enter the Kanunime. This was a massive, sweeping new set of codified laws. Before Mehmed came along, the Ottoman state relied really heavily on ancient traditions and powerful, entrenched aristocratic families. Mehmed basically swept all of that away. He was the very first sultan to issue a kanuname based solely on his own independent authority. It strictly defined the roles, the salaries, and even the brutal punishments for every single government official. He was placing himself firmly, unequivocally, above tradition. But as we know, laws need loyal men to enforce them. And this brings us to a brilliant, albeit incredibly harsh system, the devshirme. To strip power away from those old, independent noble families who might dare to challenge him, Mehmed relied heavily on this process. Young Christian boys from the provinces were recruited, converted to Islam, and given elite schooling. They grew up owing absolutely everything they had, their education, their wealth, their immense power, entirely to the Sultan. To really understand this shift, take a look at how the power base changed here. Instead of relying on independent aristocrats, Mehmed built a government of salaried bureaucrats. Instead of dealing with grand viziers who had their own rival agendas, he appointed fiercely loyal men straight from the devshirme, like his first grand vizier Zaganos Pasha. And perhaps most tellingly of all, Mehmed physically walled himself off. He built a palace and initiated a strict policy of imperial seclusion. He was no longer just a tribal leader sitting around a fire with his men. He was an untouchable, centralized autocrat. Section 5. Patron of a cosmopolitan court. We're now going to dive into the Sultan's paradoxical yet deeply personal obsession with Western Renaissance culture. As a historian in his court, let me tell you, his library was his greatest marvel. Mehmed amassed an unbelievable multilingual collection of over 8,000 manuscripts. He personally read Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin. He even went as far as setting up a dedicated Greek scriptorium just to copy out classical texts. Think about it. While he was out laying siege to heavily fortified cities, he was also patronizing scholars to preserve diverse intellectual traditions, literally studying Homer's Iliad and Arrian's histories of Alexander the Great in his downtime. He wanted to rival the great intellects of the West, not just crush their armies. And his patronage and personal collections were just staggering. He commissioned the famous Venetian Renaissance artist Gentile Bellini to come paint his portrait. When he converted the massive Hagia Sophia into a mosque, he intentionally preserved its breathtaking Christian mosaics instead of destroying them. But most surprisingly, especially for a Muslim sultan, he avidly collected Christian relics. He held the putative skull of St. John the Baptist and even the very stone on which Jesus was purportedly born. Now, some traditionalists in his court were deeply, deeply worried about all this, but Mehmed didn't care. He saw himself as a universal, cosmopolitan monarch. 100,000 ducats. To put that into perspective, that is an exorbitant fortune. That is exactly how much the Venetians offered to pay to buy back that stone of Jesus. Our records show Mehmed flat out refused, declaring he wouldn't part with it even for 100,000 ducats. To him, these cultural artifacts and holy relics were, in the words of one contemporary observer, more precious than money. Section 6. The Conqueror's Lasting Legacy. Let's transition to the massive building projects that permanently altered the map of the world. See, when Mehmed first took Constantinople, it was basically a depopulated ruin. But through the Sargun decree, he forcibly yet very pragmatically repopulated the city by moving Muslims, Christians, and Jews from all across his territories right into the capital. He built the sprawling Topkapi Palace and the monumental Fatih Mosque, which was surrounded by 8 madrasas, basically universities of Islamic science. The result of all this? By 1478, the population boomed to 80,000 people. He had practically single-handedly resurrected the city, making it the largest in all of Europe once again. But hey, don't let the beautiful art and grand architecture fool you for a second. He never actually put down the sword. While he was busy building his cultural capital, he was constantly on the march. In 1459, he formally ended the Serbian despotate. In 1461, he wiped out the absolute last vestige of the Byzantine world by conquering Trebizond. By 1463, Bosnia fell. And in 1473, at Otluk Bali, he decisively crushed his Eastern Turkic rivals, the Ak Koyunlu. He was a total master of diplomacy, expertly playing Venice, regional Balkan lords, and even the papacy against each other, while his armies just kept expanding in every single direction. And that brings us to the end of our chronicler's tale. Mehmed died in 1481 at the age of 49. He was likely poisoned, perhaps even at the behest of his own son. He left behind a legacy that literally terrified Europe. I mean, church bells rang in joy across the continent at the news of his death. Yet he also left behind the architectural and cultural marvel that is modern-day Istanbul. So, I want to leave you with this question. He conquered a city, but did his blending of East and West, his fusion of the Ghazi's sword and the Roman Caesar's intellect, conquer history? Think about what you should really take away from this explainer. The modern world was shaped not just by his cannons, but by the complex, calculating mind of a sultan who dared to be the absolute master of two lands and two seas.